I stood against the back wall, half in shadow, wearing civilian clothes that didn't belong at a military ceremony. Grey blazer, weathered combat boots, no insignia, no name tag. The ceremony roared ahead at the front of the hall, polished and loud. My sister Lila was centre stage, the golden daughter of our bloodline, basking in applause that hadn't been earned by her alone. Her commanding officer stepped to the microphone, his words sharp as bugle calls. Excellence, honour, leadership. Each syllable twisted like a blade, not because Lila didn't deserve praise, but because those virtues had been forged long before she wore a uniform. In someone else's silence, in mine. No one spoke my name. They hadn't for years. And today, I was officially erased. I scanned the rows of faces, every seat filled with family commanders, rising officers, people who played their roles with military precision. My mother sat in the front row, her navy dress stiff and unyielding pearls reflecting the overhead lights. My father beside her jaw, set hands folded over a program he hadn't opened. They looked forward like statues. Before the ceremony, I overheard them. Whispers to a church friend. Don't mention Jordan. She didn't quite make it through. I'd made it through. 20 years in black ops, half a dozen strategic theatres, 3 operations that don't officially exist. I'd made it through more than they'd ever known. But my war had been invisible by design, and so they carried on pretending I never came home at all. I wasn't invited to this ceremony. I wasn't even acknowledged. But I came anyway. Not for them. For her. Leela had once been the little girl who snuck into my bed during thunderstorms, who traced her finger across my unit patches, who used to say, "I want to be just like you." Now she stood tall, straight like a marble statue of service. My mirror image from years ago before I disappeared. Then it happened. Reception line, officers and guests shaking hands. I remained in the back unseen, until one man stopped mid-handshake. His eyes locked on me. Recognition was immediate and bone deep. He was tall, lean, all clean lines and iron posture. Colonel Greg Monroe. I knew him. He'd served under my command during Operation Firebreak, when dust filled the lungs like guilt, when I made calls that saved lives and buried others. His expression cracked slightly. Not a surprise, something older. Respect, laced with disbelief. He looked from Lila to me, then back again. He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes like he was excavating a ghost. "Mom, you're the general." The room didn't gasp. It inhaled. Applause froze in midair. A fork clinked to the floor. Someone dropped a glass. My mother went rigid. My father turned to stone. Lila didn't move. In that moment, rank didn't matter. Insignia didn't matter. What mattered was silence and who broke it. I didn't flinch. I didn't smile. I just met Monroe's gaze and nodded once. He straightened, clicked his heels and saluted. To me. That salute sliced through the room like artillery fire. A ripple of tension surged through the crowd. And just like that, every failure they'd ever whispered became obsolete. Sometimes it takes a stranger's salute to remind those who love you most exactly who you are. I'm Jordan Hale. They called me a ghost, a dropout, the one who could have been something. But today, for the first time in decades, I stepped back into the story they wrote me out of. And it begins here. Even as Monroe stepped back into line, heads began to turn. My uncle, seated 2 rows from the front, squinted, then blinked like he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. A young cadet nearby whispered, "Is that her? The one from Firebreak?" I heard it. I hear everything when I'm still. My mother didn't turn. She didn't need to. Her hand clenched around the stem of her champagne flute until her knuckles turned white. Her neck remained rigid, and in that moment, I understood something cruelly simple she had spent years rehearsing how to forget me. And here, I was refusing to stay forgotten. A few seats over, Lila tilted her head just slightly toward the back. Her jaw tensed. She didn't look me in the eyes. Not yet, but she knew. The Colonel's question, his recognition, had disrupted the script. I was never meant to be part of the scene, just the shadow beyond the curtain. And now the spotlight had found me. I remember the last time a spotlight found me. It wasn't at a ceremony or a press briefing. It was in a stark, windowless room with fluorescent lights that hummed like they knew secrets. I was 19, seated before a panel of expressionless instructors at West Point Hands, flat on the table heart, pounding a cadence of something more primal than fear. I had just completed a psychological resilience simulation designed not to be won, only to measure the limits of endurance. But I didn't break. That was the problem. Most cadets came out shaking or silent. I had walked out and asked if I could go for a run. A colonel in the observation room muttered to another, "She wasn't supposed to pass that." Another replied, "And that's exactly why she's right for this." 2 days later, I received a letter that didn't look like the others. Midnight blue envelope, wax seal, no return address. It was slipped under my door like a secret. Inside, one line handwritten on military-grade paper, "Report to Facility Echo 4. No explanation, no signature." I went. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't tell anyone. When I arrived, they scanned my retina, confiscated my ID, and burned my file. Officially, I ceased to exist. They called it strategic reassignment. I called it vanishing. Not dishonorably, not heroically. Just gone. My parents received a letter weeks later. A generic withdrawal notice. No details. Just a line, Cadet Hale has opted to discontinue her academic track. That was all they needed to confirm what they already believed, that I had failed. My mother never called. My father never asked. Lila sent a postcard once drawn in crayon, a picture of us holding hands. I kept it. The program I was drafted into didn't have a name, at least not one I was ever told. We didn't wear rank. We didn't salute. We existed between silences. It wasn't just combat. It was manipulation, deception, and survival layered in psychology. Missions so classified they left no traces except the bruises on your back and the ghosts in your head. We were the last line no one talked about. The threat beneath diplomacy. The answer to questions never asked in daylight. For years I moved through war zones as if I belonged to none. No family, no country, just objective. Sometimes I asked myself if I had died back at the academy, and this was what came after. But then I'd see someone, a girl crouched under rubble, a child hidden in the shadows of Fallujah, and I'd remember why I said yes. Still part of me kept waiting for someone from home to reach out. Not a parade, just a question. Why did you leave? But the call never came, because in their minds I had quit, given up, tarnished the legacy. They wore shame like it was discipline, and I became their cautionary tale. I didn't resent them, not then, not yet. But I did start writing letters I never sent, drafts in notebooks, scraps of honesty hidden under socks and ammunition. Dear Mum, I left because I was asked to protect things you'll never see. Dear Dad, I didn't fail. I disappeared because they needed someone who wouldn't flinch. Dear Lila, I'm still your sister, even if I wear shadows now. One night before a deployment, I wasn't expected to survive. My handler slid a note across a table. No briefing, just one sentence. Those who vanish voluntarily often carry the heaviest truths. Underneath a small brass coin with a hawk etched in the centre, their version of a thank you. I carried that coin for years, pressed into the seam of my boot. Every step was a reminder I wasn't lost. I was chosen. But that's not how the world saw it. That's not how my mother said it in church. Jordan could have been something. But she didn't have what it takes. That one stung more than shrapnel. Because what does it take? What it takes is burying your name with your comrades. What it takes is staring down a barrel, not because you want to, but because no one else can. What it takes is being forgotten on purpose. Now, years later, standing in a room where my sister was celebrated for completing the path I had once begun, I felt the old ghost stir. Not anger, not pride, just truth rising like smoke from a letter never opened. Behind the smile in my mind was the image of that blue envelope sealed with silence, and the words of the man who handed it to me etched into memory like scripture. You weren't supposed to pass this. That's why you're perfect. And maybe he was right, because I did pass, and then I disappeared. But ghosts, no matter how quiet, have a way of being seen. I tried once. I tried to come back from the quiet. Not with medals or files or truths too heavy for Sunday dinner. Just a voice, a conversation, something real. I was home for 72 hours between deployments. It was Christmas. Lila had just turned 15. The tree was too tall for the living room, jammed into a corner like a reluctant guest. My mother decorated it with militant precision. No mismatched bulbs. No handmade crafts. Red, gold, white. Order always. I remember the way Lila looked at me when I walked in, like I was someone she'd dreamed about but didn't quite believe still existed. You cut your hair, she whispered, and your eyes look different. I smiled. Different how she didn't answer. Just hugged me, like maybe if she held on tight enough, she could squeeze the secrets out of me. That night, after the house had gone quiet, I sat on the floor of her room. She leaned against the wall in pajamas with penguins on them. So, what do you do now? She asked. Her voice was curious, not suspicious. Still soft, still trusting. I opened my mouth. And I froze. Not because I didn't know how to explain covert intelligence or false identities, but because I knew deep down that whatever I said next would either fracture her belief in me or stain her innocence. So I told her a story about a woman who travelled the world chasing stolen stars, about maps that only showed themselves when you were ready, about people who spoke in riddles and missions written in invisible ink. She listened like children do with all her heart. When I finished, she whispered, "That sounds lonely." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. She reached for my hand and fell asleep with her fingers wrapped around mine. I stayed there until dawn. Later that day, I tried with my mother. I stood beside her as she basted a turkey with mechanical efficiency. "Mum," I said, clearing my throat, "there's something I want to talk about." She didn't look at me. "If it's about money, we're fine. Lila's college is covered. It's not money. Then it can wait." It can't. I tried again. The letter you got from West Point wasn't the whole story. I was reassigned. I know. She cut me off without hesitation, her voice sharp like a blade across bone. "We don't need the details. You made your choice. Let's not relive it." I stared at her, not in anger, not even disbelief. Just hollow resignation. "Aren't you even curious?" I asked quietly. That made her pause, briefly. She set the buster down, turned to face me, and said something I'll never forget. "Jordan, curiosity is a luxury we don't have in this family. We deal with facts. And the fact is, you left. I left." That was the only truth she allowed herself to believe. I walked away from the table and spent the rest of dinner in silence. My father didn't ask a thing. He passed me the peas like nothing had been said, like I was just visiting from a failed semester abroad. The only person who looked at me differently was Lila, and even then it was a look filled more with questions than belief. The next time I tried, I sent a letter. Just one page, no operations, no classified content, just pieces of myself, a memory, a regret, a line that said, I still think about the snow globe you broke when we were kids. I never got a reply. But I did get a phone call from my aunt 3 weeks later. Your mother asked me to tell you not to write again unless it's about something practical. Practical. Like lawn care. Like insurance. Like silence. Over time, I learned that truth in my family was a threat. That silence was safer for them and eventually for me. I didn't stop loving them. I just stopped giving them the parts of me they had already decided weren't welcome. And when the missions got darker, when the nights became endless, and my hands trembled from memories I couldn't process, I'd write again. Pages I'd never send. Some for Lila, some for my mother. Some of the version of myself that still believed coming home meant being understood. But nothing ever made it into the mailbox. Because every time I sealed an envelope, I remembered my mother's voice you left. And in that statement, there was no room for anything else. Eventually, I stopped trying. And that's when the silence became something I wore not out of fear, not even shame, but necessity. Like a second skin. Like a uniform. Like armour that didn't shine but held. I hadn't noticed the mirror when I first entered the hall. It was tucked into the far corner, behind a column of navy flags and ceremonial wreaths, angled just enough to catch the edges of the room. But after the colonel's salute, after the oxygen was sucked out of the air and everyone returned to pretending I didn't exist, I wandered toward it, drawn not by vanity but verification. I needed to see what they saw. If I had become the myth they whispered about. The mirror was tall, gilded with brass and age. It reflected the crowd like a broken memory, fractured, distorted, honest in the wrong ways. And there I was, not the ghost, not the general. Just a woman in combat boots and a pressed blazer that didn't quite fit anymore. I studied myself like I might study a hostage photo. My face wasn't stern, but it was tired. Not weak, just used. There were lines where laughter once lived. Scars behind the ears, eyes that didn't blink unless they had to. I looked detached, present but not tethered, like someone whose body showed up but soul stayed packed in a footlocker somewhere in a safe house overseas. I had to remind myself to breathe. Behind me, the reflection shifted. A man in a wheelchair sat at the edge of the room, tucked just behind a potted ficus that shielded him from full view. His posture was straight military still, but the lines around his mouth told a different story. I turned slowly. It took me a moment to recognize him. He wasn't wearing the unit insignia anymore. No medals, no name. But I knew that face. Sergeant Elias Red Kramer, my comms lead from Oran Province. He had taken shrapnel to the spine while shielding a wounded civilian. Refused a medevac until the rest of the team was out. They said he'd never walk again. They were right, but they didn't say he'd survive with that much dignity intact. Our eyes met in the mirror first, then directly. No nod, no smile, just presence. A silent confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that my story lived in more than my memory. He raised one finger to his temple and tapped just once, then dropped it. In our language, that meant still clear, still watching, still here. I swallowed something sharp and invisible. I wanted to go to him, to sit beside him and talk like we used to, trading silence for meaning. But this room wasn't built for us. It was built for a ceremony, for Polish, for clean endings, not for the survivors, not for the shadows. And Red understood that. His presence was a gift, one I didn't deserve but needed. I gave a slight nod, nothing showy. Just enough. He winked once slowly and looked away, back to the stage, back to pretending. I turned back to the mirror. For the first time, I noticed that my reflection was slightly out of alignment with my body, a trick of the angle, or maybe a metaphor. Maybe the person I saw and the person I was had never quite lined up. I reached up, touched my collarbone, and let my fingers graze the chain hidden beneath my shirt. The pendant there was nondescript to anyone else, but I knew it. The last coordinates of our mission in Kabul etched in steel. A reminder of where we almost died, of what we saved, of whom we didn't. The hall behind me erupted into applause again. Lila had just finished her speech. I missed every word. I didn't need to hear it. I knew the tone, the cadence, the emphasis on service, legacy, and duty. I had written that script years ago with actions instead of syllables. And now she performed it with elegance. She didn't glance back. But I saw her eyes flicker in the mirror just for a second, as if checking if I was still there. I was, for now. Someone walked past me and muttered under their breath, "She's the one from Firebreak, right?" I didn't respond. My hands stayed at my sides. My spine didn't move. But internally, I felt something shift. I wasn't here to haunt. I wasn't here to reclaim. I was here to be seen. Not understood. Just seen. And in that mirror, despite the years and the distance and the failures whispered behind closed doors, I was finally visible, if only to myself. The reception hall had shifted tone, no longer purely celebration, but something quieter, more fragile. The kind of quiet that follows a question no one meant to ask. Colonel Monroe stood near the buffet, a glass of still water in one hand, his eyes not leaving mine. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "I served under her," he said suddenly, the words slicing clean across the room like a bayonet. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks paused mid-air. Laughter shriveled into tight throats. Fallujah, Sector 9. You all remember that report. Hostage extractions. Firebreak protocol. His voice stayed calm, but his jaw tightened. What the file didn't tell you what it couldn't is that the woman who stood behind me that day wasn't waiting for orders. He turned slightly toward me, not gesturing, just facing. She didn't wait. She led. Someone coughed. The air got heavier. We were pinned. 2 alleyways are blocked. One of ours has already hit. The command said, "Hold position." She didn't. She moved. He exhaled slowly. And because she moved, we're here. Because she moved, we walked out instead of being zipped into flags. Lila was frozen by the bar, a glass of champagne untouched in her hand. Her eyes flicked from Monroe to me, like she was seeing a stranger in both places. My mother sat rigid at the table, her posture perfect, but her hand trembled just once before she caught it. My father had the decency to lower his eyes. Monroe wasn't finished. "I owe her my life," he said. "And more than that, I owe her my name. Because if she hadn't made the call, none of us would have come back with ours." He looked around the room now. Slowly, intentionally. She never asked for recognition. She never spoke of it. But some silences deserve to be broken. And then he looked directly at my mother. Not cruel, not challenging, just honest. "If she were my daughter," he said, "I'd have built a monument, not a wall." The words didn't echo. They landed, soft and sharp, like snowfall on glass. My mother didn't speak. Her lips pressed tight, skin pale around the mouth. But in her eyes I saw something I hadn't seen since childhood confusion. Not hatred, not shame, just uncertainty. Like she didn't know how to rearrange the portrait of me she'd spent decades painting. And maybe that was more terrifying to her than anything else. Lila took a step back, as if her balance betrayed her. The carefully curated confidence in her posture faltered. She looked down, as if the floor might explain the past to her better than I ever could. I remained where I was. Not because I didn't have something to say, but because Monroe had already said it better than I ever could. And, more than that, because the room didn't need my voice. They needed the truth. and it had just been handed to them, delivered not with fanfare but with clarity, like a quiet apology wrapped in someone else's voice. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. A man near the doorway murmured, "I thought she quit." Another replied, "No, she just wasn't allowed to return." That was enough. That whisper was the echo I had waited years to hear, not applause, not glory, just correction. My story pulled back from the margins, drawn back into the conversation. Monroe returned to his drink. He didn't look at me again. He didn't need to. His presence, his words had already done what needed doing. The weight he carried had been passed, if only for a moment, and I caught it like an old comrade catching a rifle. I looked at my mother once. Her eyes didn't meet mine, but her shoulders had lowered ever so slightly. Not surrender, but a shift, a crack, the kind of fracture that makes way for new air. Lila, on the other hand, looked like someone whose favourite story had just been rewritten. She didn't move, didn't speak, but her gaze no longer held certainty. That, in itself, was its own kind of justice. A younger officer nearby leaned into a friend and said quietly, "She was the one who made the call." And though he said it like a question, I knew it would grow into belief. That's how stories worked. Quiet, then viral. Once the truth starts breathing, it doesn't go back to sleep. I stayed silent, not out of habit this time, but by choice. Because the truth didn't need my voice to stand. It already had legs of its own. That night, I didn't stay for cake or speeches or the inevitable rewrites of family history that would follow. I slipped out a side door, blending with the shadows that had always known my name. The air outside was sharper, almost honest in its chill. I drove home with the windows down, letting the cold bite my skin just enough to remind me I was still here, still flesh and breath, not some apparition conjured by guilt or revelation. My apartment hadn't changed in years. Same worn floorboards, same coffee ring on the counter, same stack of unopened mail collecting dust on the hallway table. It was a space built for absence, silent, functional, private. I didn't turn on the lights, just walked straight to the shelf in the back closet, the one behind the military manuals and the false bottom storage bin. I pulled down a small unmarked box. Inside it, a letter folded too many times, yellowing at the edges like it had aged in dog years, and a ring. Black steel engraved with a single phrase, Unit Echo. No witnesses, no graves. The ring had never touched my finger. It didn't feel like mine, though I'd earned it. Or maybe because I'd earned it too well. I sat at the edge of my bed and unfolded the letter, careful not to tear the corners. The handwriting was blocky efficient, military script. But the words, they bled. LT. If you're reading this, I didn't make it. That's not your fault. Don't let them ever say it is. I volunteered every time, and I'd do it again. You gave us something to believe in. You didn't blink. You didn't abandon. You stood between chaos and the rest of us. If no one else ever says it, I want you to know I died believing in your call. That's enough for me. Live like it matters. That's enough for both of us. Signed, Private First Class, James A. Reddick. He'd been 24. He had a crooked smile and a stutter when he was tired. He once spent an entire night pulling a wounded child out of rubble with nothing but a bent crowbar and sheer will. We lost him in Kandahar in a breach gone wrong. His body was never recovered, but this letter had been in his locker, left with instructions to send it to me only if the worst happened. I held the paper for a long time, letting his words wash over me like a confession I didn't deserve. I had read it before, on anniversaries, on sleepless nights, after mission debriefs that ended in silence and whiskey. But tonight, it hit differently. Maybe because someone finally said my name in public. Maybe because, for the first time in years, I wasn't carrying this alone. I reached for the ring. It felt heavier than it should have. I pressed it into my palm, curled my fingers around it. "You didn't blink," he'd written. But the truth is, I had, not in combat, but in life, in love, in trusting the people who were supposed to love me back. I stood and walked to the mirror above the sink, not the ceremonial kind, the brutal one, the one that showed every line, every bruise, every decision etched into skin. I held the ring up. My hand trembled just slightly, then slowly I slid it onto my finger. No ceremony, no witness, just the dead and me and the silence between us. It fit perfectly, like it had been waiting. Like I whispered into the empty room. "If you still believe in me, I'll try to believe in me too." Then I sat down, opened a drawer and pulled out the folder I had hidden since my last deployment. Inside were half-written letters. To Lila, to my mother, to the people who never asked what happened but filled in their own blanks. I chose one, the one with the least anger and the most truth. I added one line at the bottom. "Today, someone said my name out loud. I just thought you should know. I didn't seal it. Not yet." But for the first time, I didn't tear it up either. The next morning started ordinarily. Coffee black, emails, a stretch of quiet that felt earned. Until my phone buzzed. Once, then again. Then too many times to ignore. Group threads I hadn't opened in years suddenly blinked to life. Old unit channels encrypted contacts, burner lines going cold hot. At first I thought it might have been about Monroe's speech. Maybe word had spread. But when I opened the first message, my stomach dropped. A link, no greeting, no context, just 6 words. "You need to see this now." The article was already trending, on niche veteran forums, military Reddit subthreads, dark circles that followed defense leaks like blood in water. Title in bold, Fallujah Files, Hidden Hero, or Ghost of Guilt. It wasn't just speculation. It wasn't even tabloid. It was surgical, loaded with details only someone on the inside could have known. Mission times, code names, snippets of redacted logs that had never been made public. And right there, in the second paragraph, my name, Jordan Hale. Full designation. A career history built in shadows, now dragged into fluorescent light, dissected in real time by strangers. There were quotes from unnamed senior analysts, speculative assessments of whether civilians had been caught in the crossfire. The tone wasn't accusatory, not directly, but it was slippery. The kind of narrative that lets readers make their own judgment, all while stacking the deck. It didn't matter that it wasn't fully true, or that most of it lacked context. What mattered was perception, and perception, once shifted, spreads like wildfire through dry brush. I read it twice, then a third time. The phrasing, it rang a bell. There was a cadence to it, arrogant, precise, dressed in pseudo-ethics. A voice I tried to forget. I opened a separate terminal, ran a metadata trace on the first image embedded in the article. Whoever leaked it had covered their tracks well, but not perfectly. There was a tell. An internal formatting tag one used exclusively in a discontinued reporting framework we'd once used in Task Unit 7. A system decommissioned years ago after the breach in Riyadh. Only 3 people ever had full access to those files. Myself, Colonel Benson, now retired, and living off-grid in Oregon, and Victor Rohn. Rohn. The name hit like a broken rib. We had worked together on 2 missions. He was brilliant, erratic, and obsessed with patterns. We'd shared long nights decoding intel, longer silences afterward. There had been something once, a closeness. Not love, not quite, but intensity, the kind that hums just under the skin. He wanted more. I didn't. He didn't handle that well. When he was transferred after an ethics review, I never asked why. I didn't want to know, but now I did. I dug deeper. logged into an old mirrored system that hadn't seen daylight in 6 years. I found archived communication logs, encrypted message bursts from a time when we still trusted each other. Among them, a draft was never sent. His, addressed to me. You think they'll remember you because you stayed clean. But ghosts fade, Jordan. I won't. It was dated 2 weeks after our final operation together. 2 weeks after he'd been pulled from rotation without explanation. 2 weeks after I had refused to cover his decision to push unauthorized surveillance on a civilian zone. Back then, I thought that silence was enough to end it. Now I understood it was just the beginning. I pulled up a secure archive and searched for his name. Last logged location, Maryland, defense subcontractor. Access revoked from most high clearance nets, but not all. The leak had come from someone with just enough privilege left to still touch shadows, and enough bitterness to set them on fire. I stared at the screen for a long time, trying to feel something. Anger, betrayal, fear. But what came was clarity. Cold and precise. Roan didn't publish that article to destroy me. That would be too crude. He wanted doubt, uncertainty. He wanted to twist the narrative before I ever had a chance to speak. He wanted me erased not because I failed, but because I hadn't needed him. I reached for the phone and called a number. Monroe. He picked up on the second ring. It's live, I said. I saw it, he replied. It's Roan, I said. I'm sure. There was a pause. Then, you know what comes next. Yeah, I said quietly. I do. I walked to the safe behind the bookshelf. The same one I hadn't opened since leaving the program. Inside, one encrypted hard drive, 3 old patches, and a burner phone preloaded with protocols for internal investigation access. I activated it. A light blinked green. Game on. The burner buzzed to life, pulling old code into the present, like dragging bones from beneath floorboards. I initiated trace protocols, deep forensic sweeps, layered encryption filters, all the tools we were taught to use, not for glory, but for silence. It didn't take long. The breach came from a base-issued laptop. The Source A device registered under one name, Second Lieutenant Lila Hale, my sister. I stared at the name for a full minute. My hands didn't shake. My breath didn't catch. But something inside me pulled tight like a memory trying to stay buried. I reran the trace twice. Same result. It hadn't been her voice in the article, not her fingerprints on the story's structure, but the digital doorway she'd left it open. A training terminal with partial clearance, likely unattended during a sync. A door left ajar, and Roan, the scavenger he was, had slipped through. I didn't call, didn't message. I drove. She wasn't on base when I arrived. The young soldier at the gate told me she'd left early personal leave, no known destination. I tried the old place's library, annex field training site, even the overlook where she used to watch night drills just to feel like something was coming. Nothing. Then I checked the one place she used to go when she didn't want to be found, our grandfather's old farmhouse, long abandoned on the edge of a county line no one remembered. I found her on the porch steps out of uniform, for the first time in weeks, hugging a cup of coffee, like it might keep the past from touching her. She didn't look up when I parked, didn't say my name when I approached. I sat beside her without a word. The air smelled like cedar and old wallpaper. The porch creaked beneath our silence. Inside the house, the windows had dust on the inside, and light leaked through them like forgotten dreams. After a long pause, she spoke. I didn't mean to, she said, voice raw. I didn't even know it was real. I waited. I was running a scenario in the simulator room, just checking how data flows work in high-pressure conditions. The folder was unlabeled, and it didn't throw a security warning when I opened it. She paused. I thought it was mock data. A training program. It wasn't, I said. I know that now. There was something brittle in her voice like someone trying to sound older than their guilt would allow. I remembered a younger version of her in mismatched socks, holding my boots like relics. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you. And now, here she was, not a child, not innocent, just unprepared. She turned toward me, eyes red-rimmed. Am I the reason they know? Yes, I said. But you're not the one who used it. Tears welled. I just wanted to understand you, she whispered. I wanted to see what they wouldn't tell me. What you wouldn't. And what did you find? She didn't answer. I didn't mean to betray you, she said after a while. I know. I was just jealous, she added, almost a whisper. All my life, you were the one they didn't talk about. And somehow, you were still the one I looked up to. I glanced toward the window, where light caught on an old photo in a cracked frame, me and Lila on the front porch, her in my old cap grinning so wide it barely fit in the frame. Jealousy isn't betrayal, I said quietly, but negligence. That starts wars. She flinched, not from anger, from truth. Then, after a beat, her voice wavered. I think I wanted to be you, but the version they remembered, the version that disappeared before the shadows came. I turned to her, really, but I looked not as the sister I'd shielded, nor the soldier she tried to become. Just as someone standing in front of the truth, raw and blinking. You don't need to apologize, I said. You need to be ready, because once the next door opens, there's no closing it. She nodded slowly. We didn't hug. We didn't cry. But when I handed her the second burner loaded with decryption logs, trace maps, and the raw version of the breach trail, she took it like someone holding a burden she finally understood. War doesn't begin with bullets. It begins with assumptions. And someone, somewhere, always forgets to lock the door. 2 nights later, we found the place. A warehouse outside Silver Spring, Maryland, abandoned on paper, but too well maintained to be forgotten. Records said it was once a supply hub for non-lethal military surplus. What they didn't say was that it now held digital ghosts and possibly the man who conjured them. Lila drove. I navigated. Neither of us spoke much. The roads were slick with rain and our thoughts moved heavier than the tires slicing through the dark. Her fingers clutched the wheel too tightly. Mine never left the USB drive loaded with encrypted evidence enough to bury a man like Roan if the world still cared for justice. When we arrived, the building loomed like a mausoleum. No guards, no lights beyond one flickering bulb near a side door. The type of silence that didn't sleep, it waited. I motioned for Lila to stay by the car. If I'm not back in 15, you send the signal. She didn't argue. Inside, the air was cold, not in temperature, but in intent. It smelled of metal and secrets. Every echo reminded me that this wasn't a battlefield with rules. This was theatre, and Roan would play director. He stood near the centre exactly as I expected. His hands were folded behind his back. Same smirk, same hunger in his eyes like he'd been rehearsing this meeting for years. Took you long enough, he said. You left a trail, I replied. I knew you'd find it, he said, almost admiring. You always do. That's why I needed you here. This moment. It needs witnesses. I'm not here for your monologue. He stepped forward, circling slightly. You think they'll believe you, Jordan? That your words still hold? I've got documents, threads, doubt. That's all it takes now. You're not wrong, I said, but you forgot one thing. He stopped. What's that? I didn't come alone. A soft click echoed from behind the shelves. Lila stepped into view, calm, steady, and holding the device that pinged Roan's location to a secure military uplink. His smirk faltered. Oh, he said so, the baby Hale plays soldier now. Did she tell you how she opened the door? Or were you too busy playing martyr to notice Lila isn't the one who weaponized it, I said. You are. He laughed. You always had the image? The mystique, the disappeared general with secrets no one could confirm. But I did the work, Jordan. I built the algorithms, wrote the networks. You were just the face they liked to salute. You're not the architect, I said. You're the echo, loud but fading. I was the one who made the calls. I led when no one else could breathe through the dust. He tilted his head, still playing hero. No, I said. I buried heroes. You buried files. His face tightened, something cracked in his posture. You think you're clean, he said. You think saving lives makes you sacred. We both did things. You just had better PR. I never needed PR, I said. I had graves and names and blood on my boots. He took a step forward. I gave you everything, access, intelligence, even trust. And you walked away like none of it mattered. You gave me leverage. I gave you restraint. Don't mistake the two. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The only sound was the slow blink of the emergency light above us. Red, red, red. Then I said it. You're not the mind. You're the noise. He opened his mouth to respond, but I stepped closer. I'm the memory, I said coldly. And memories don't fade just because the liar yells louder. That was when the warehouse doors opened. 2 unmarked SUVs rolled in. Officers stepped out, quiet, deliberate, trained for this. Roan froze. Too late for another rewrite, I told him. As they cuffed him, he didn't resist. But he turned to Lila, eyes sharp, with one last wound to give. You'll never be her, he said. And Lila, quiet, unwavering, met his stare. I don't have to be. I just have to be the one who stopped you. They led him away. When the door shut behind him, I exhaled. Not relief, not triumph, just release. Lila walked over, standing beside me in the echo. Is it over? She asked. No, I said. But this part is. We stepped out into the night together. Rain is falling again, cold and honest, like the truth we'd finally dragged into the light. It wasn't over, not in the way movies pretend it ends with the bad guy hauled off and the heroine standing under a streetlight applause. No. In real life, closure is quieter. It breathes slower. And sometimes it doesn't feel like a victory at all. 2 days later, a formal invitation arrived. Not a summons, not a subpoena, but a ceremony. High command. They wanted me present for a full debriefing and symbolic recognition of my contributions to Operation Firebreak, Desert Shield, and other missions whose names still couldn't be spoken aloud in public channels. There'd be medals, a press statement, a citation to pin on a uniform I hadn't worn in 15 years. They even offered to reinstate my record, reinvent my history. Like everything in the shadows had simply been a prelude to this applause. I didn't respond immediately. I just closed the message, sat in the dark, and stared at the ring on my finger. Recognition, a stage, a speech. It felt hollow, because the truth is survivors don't always want to win. Not like that. Not when the cost has no stage and the names you'd thank aren't alive to hear them. I went anyway, but not for the medal. The Pentagon briefing room was as impersonal as ever, neutral walls, polished wood, a flag that seemed both proud and exhausted. I walked in without ceremony. I wore the same blazer from Lila's commissioning, the one that had seen battlefields and banquet halls. I didn't carry anything. No notes, no speech. 3 generals waited behind the table. 1 I knew, 2 I didn't. Lila was in the corner, standing straight, her expression unreadable. My parents had arrived before me, seated quietly on the opposite side of the room. My mother's hair was perfectly pinned, but her hands were folded too tightly. General McKellen cleared his throat. Colonel, hail, former colonel, I corrected. He nodded, then offered a tight smile. We're here to rectify that. He spoke of valor, of sacrifice, of exceptional leadership under impossible constraints. He detailed missions I hadn't thought anyone would admit existed. He used words like hero and national asset. Then he slid a velvet box across the table. Inside was a medal I hadn't seen since childhood. The Distinguished Service Cross. Official reinstatement. Rank, record commendation, all yours, he said. My father looked over. His jaw moved slightly like he was chewing on regret. I stared at the medal, then closed the box. I decline, I said. Silence. I didn't come for recognition. I continued. I came to make sure the people who didn't make it home weren't erased. General McKellen leaned forward. You deserve to be known, Colonel. You deserve to be remembered properly. I shook my head. They weren't remembered at all, and I won't build a monument atop names that never made the paperwork. A moment passed. Then, 2. My mother stood. She stepped forward slowly, as if each movement was unsteady, not in body, but in belief. Her eyes searched mine. Not for confirmation, not for pride, for comprehension. And then softly, so softly I almost didn't hear it, she said, I don't know how to love someone who doesn't need my approval. The words sat between us like a verdict. For 20 years we'd been divided by silence. Not anger, not absence, just the inability to speak the same language. Her love had always come in conditional tones, perfect, posture, high ranks, predictable paths. I had walked into the dark instead, and she had never followed. But in that moment, she admitted it. She named the gap, and in doing so, she reached across it. I know I said, I didn't need it, but I wanted it anyway. Her breath caught, and for the first time since West Point, she touched my arm. Not stiffly, not out of obligation, just touch, just presence. Lila stepped forward then. She didn't need to be loved by the system, she said, voice even. She needed to be loved by us. No applause followed, no national anthem, just a quiet room full of people who had, all in their own ways, failed and been forgiven. I left without the medal, but not empty-handed. Sometimes the only victory a survivor wants is to be heard without having to shout. 3 weeks later, a request came in the Mail Official West Point stationery, crisp and formal. They wanted me to return, not to be honoured, but to speak to the graduating class about leadership, about legacy, about the kind of courage that doesn't make the front page. I stood behind the stage curtain that morning, adjusting the sleeve of my blazer. No uniform, no medals. Just a folded letter from Ellis in my pocket and years of words I had never spoken aloud. Jordan Hale, the speaker called. No rank, no title, just my name. I walked into the spotlight under the quiet gaze of hundreds of cadets, each one sitting straighter than the last. They were young, eager, rigid in their understanding of discipline, still untouched by the ghost of consequence. I stood at the podium, hands resting lightly on either side, and let the silence settle. I had learned a long time ago that silence held with purpose is louder than applause. I'm not here to talk about medals, I began, or glory, or victory. A few brows furrowed. I'm here to talk about what no one teaches you to carry. A pause. Honour is a word that gets thrown around a lot. We paste it onto posters, sew it into slogans, but most of the time we mistake it for ceremony. Some shifted in their seats. Honour isn't the flag folded at your funeral. It's the friend who never got one. It's the mission no one will ever know you led. It's the moment you wake up at 3 a.m. because in your dream, someone called for backup and you couldn't get there. The air changed. Honour doesn't come from being remembered. It comes from remembering. I let that hang there. In my pocket, I carry a letter. It's from a man named Ellis, a soldier who didn't make it out. He wrote it before our last mission. We weren't supposed to have casualties. We weren't even supposed to exist. I held up the envelope. He wrote, "If no one ever thanks you, remember I died believing in you." You could hear a pin drop. I carry his name. And 3 others. Not on paper, not in any official file, but in a breath. in heartbeat, in every moment I hesitate before speaking because they can't. A young cadet in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth. This job, I said quieter now, isn't about being saluted. It's about who you carry when no one's looking. A slow murmur rippled through the room, of breath being held, then released. Some of you will become commanders. Some will never see combat. And some of you will lose pieces of yourselves and never find the words to explain it. I leaned forward. When that happens, don't look for applause. Look for memory. Look for silence that tells the truth louder than any speech. Then I said the line I had never dared say in public. Honor doesn't come from medals. It comes from the nights you wake up knowing you're still alive because someone else couldn't be. The stillness in the room was almost holy. One cadet stood, straight, silent, saluting. Another followed. Then the entire auditorium rose in unison. No commands, just something ancient and human, respect stripped bare. I didn't return the salute. I didn't need to. I simply nodded and stepped down. Backstage, the light was dimmer. Lila waited. She had watched the whole thing from behind the curtain. Her eyes were glassy, but not from tears. From understanding. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say, "You were right." She handed me a small white box. Inside was a cupcake. Vanilla. Sloppy frosting. And written in icing with a hand that had clearly trembled, General. Sister. Ghost. I didn't eat it. But I held it in my lap the entire drive home. Because sometimes the smallest offering is the one that says, you are no longer invisible. The next morning, I drove without telling anyone. No uniform, no agenda. Just the ring on my finger and the cupcake box, now empty, sitting beside me like a silent witness. The memorial was carved into the side of a wind-bent hill, overlooking what used to be Base Echo. Officially decommissioned, unofficially never acknowledged. The kind of place they let fade until it becomes a legend or a cautionary tale. Gravel crunched under my boots as I approached the wall. Granite, weather-worn and still somehow too clean. Names stretched across it like a whisper of Sacrifice Mendoza. Ellis, Reddick, Hale. There. My name. Restored. After all the erasure, all the silence, it sat between ghosts and flame like it had always belonged. The lettering was shallow, freshly etched, not yet darkened by time. Proof, not of legacy, but of recent amends. I reached out fingers tracing each groove. Not to verify, but to feel. It was real. I was real. The wind tugged at the edges of my coat as if reminding me that even this moment was borrowed. And I stood there not as a general, not as a sister, just as someone who had survived enough to stand still. That's when I heard the voice, Ko konyo chao kong. I turned. A little girl. 8, maybe 9, big eyes, red scarf. The shoes are slightly too big. She clutched a laminated photo in one hand, frayed at the corners. We met a long time ago, she said, switching to English. You carried me out of a building. It was burning. I knelt slowly, heart pacing a rhythm older than language. 9 Mile Creek. She nodded. My dad said I wouldn't be alive if you hadn't come back for me. I looked at her closely, really looked. Her hair was longer now. The scar on her cheek had faded into something barely noticeable. But the eyes, those I remembered, wide, watching, waiting to be saved. Your name is Amira. Her smile bloomed like forgiveness. You remember? I nodded, emotion knotting somewhere behind my ribs. How could I forget? She stepped closer, pressing the photo into my hand. It was us blurred chaotic mid-rescue. She was curled in my arms, ash streaking both our faces, and behind us, the inferno I'd walked through to get her out. They gave this to me later, she whispered. My teacher says we should thank our heroes. But I didn't want to just say thank you. I looked back at the wall, at my name, then back to her. Ciao lali doko van kon jung jai. She tilted her head, not fully understanding the weight of those words, but sensing it like children do. Really? Really? I said. When things got hard, I remembered your face. It reminded me that saving one life means everything. A beat of silence passed between us, full and alive. Then, her group called from a distance. She turned, waving once, and ran off across the field. I stayed, long after her footsteps faded, long after the wind died down, long after memory gave way to stillness. And I let the quiet hold me, not like a burden, but like a home I hadn't known I missed. Behind me, my name remained, carved not for fame, not for ceremony, but for truth. For once I didn't flinch. I didn't hide. I didn't disappear. If you're out there reading this, watching this, hearing this, I hope you know that silence doesn't have to be forever. Pain doesn't have to be exile. And survival. It's not a finish line. It's a beginning. Drop your stories in the comments. Someone else out there is surviving in silence. Let them know they're not alone. Let them know you were here. Let them know they still matter.